So really this is, I just want to say a few words about my contribution to the book. And I'm really, really honored to be in this book with such amazing contributors. And Tony didn't mention, but Howard Zinn is in the book. And I don't know if it's the last thing he wrote, but it's probably one of the last things he published. And I think it's a great testament.
It is the last thing
that he published.
Yeah.
Sorry. So I think it's really a great testament, not just to the book, but to the topic in general. And I hope it will get publicity. I don't want it to get publicity through somebody's death, obviously, but I do think that the people who contributed to the book are extremely interesting activist scholars. And as Tony said, some of them are not the people whose name you're going to see in the title of the chapters, but they're talking about the people who couldn't write about themselves, about academic repression. So I mean, I'm looking forward to reading it, so I haven't got a chance to read all of it. So I just want to talk briefly about my contribution in this book, and maybe it will raise kind of issues that you didn't confront until now, didn't think about as related to academic repression. My chapter is not about the kind of Finkelstein for Churchill. It's not about freedom of speech issues. It's really not about issues related to one individual or individual representing a group of people in the form that I think a lot of the other chapters are. But it's basically trying to push the idea that ableism is a form of oppression and repression, and trying to talk about how that plays out within academia and how it plays out within academia when it gets corporatized. So that is basically the premise of the chapter. I wrote a chapter with a colleague of mine called Sumi Colligan. She's a professor in anthropology in Massachusetts College of Liberal Arts. And basically when Anthony kind of approached me with this topic, because he knew I have interest in higher education, disability, and so forth, and I'm also consider myself a scholar activist, then I was a little bit hesitant because I thought, wow, you know, does it really compare to an Angela Davis or to a Ward Churchill? You know, like I was never in prison because I have, you know, a disability and I'm in the academy. So the chapter is not really about that, and it's really kind of not trying to play a game of who's more oppressed, but it's really trying to say that there is such a thing in the academy as ableism, as a form of oppression. And so one of the ideas that we're trying to promote with this chapter, and this chapter is called Regimes of Normalcy in the Academy, is basically the fact that we all have to apply ourselves to this rule of normalcy. So what we're trying to push the reader to do is to not say, okay, this is the plight of people with disabilities in the academy, or this is the plight of women of color in the academy, and so forth. But this is your plight, and this is your fight, because we're all part of the disability system. Just like, you know, race, we're all raced, not just people of color. So racial struggles are our struggles. Also, in relation to the academy, what we found statistically is that a lot of the people who got disabled after they were already hired. So age has a lot to do with disability as well. So the longer that you stay in one profession, such as the academy, you're going to have some sort of disability or another. But of course, we also found barriers to people to get hired. And this goes to Anthony's point about students. The reason why you don't see as many, perhaps, faculty with visible disabilities, and I'm sure you agree that you don't, is because you don't see students with a lot of visible disabilities. It doesn't mean you don't have students with disabilities who are taking your classes, you probably just don't know that you do, because the percentage of learning disabilities, for instance, is very high. So a lot of disabilities are invisible, but there's a lot of barriers for people with visible and invisible disabilities to even get to the academic kind of game. So if they have problems as students, they're not going to get there as faculty. So that's kind of one of the barriers that we are talking about. The other barrier is, of course, the barrier of physical barrier. that we talk about. So for instance, you know, when this room is set up, obviously this room is not set up for me to teach in or to me to, you know, kind of speak to you. What, there's a ramp?
No.
That's what I'm trying to say. Sorry if I wasn't clear. There's steps here, and there's no ramp here. So, you know, universities are set up for a particular individual to speak in. So, of course, particular universities are set up so initially so that they were designed for men, for instance, and you see kind of add-on for women later, and we see that in a lot of universities. But they're also very much designed for able-bodied people. So they're designed, again, with this kind of rule of normalcy in mind, and in a lot of ways this rule of normalcy affects us all, because if you ever sat in the classroom, I haven't seen the classroom here, but do they have those chairs where you kind of have to push yourself in and then the thing comes here and you have to write on? Are those the kind of setups? I mean, those are not comfortable for anybody. So this rule of like the average student really doesn't work for any of our benefits, okay? Not to mention if you have to write with your left hand, not to mention if you don't like the thing, not to mention if you're heavier, not to mention if you can't get into those things, not to mention if you have to move those things, and so forth. Those are just like, you know, kind of little examples that we actually did give in the chapter, but I'm giving to you now as a form of kind of ableism in the academy. We focused more on kind of systematic types of oppression. So for instance, about legal issues related to the hiring and retention of faculty with disabilities. The fact that in most universities, we actually couldn't find any, I don't think, that, you know, the buzzword right now is diversity, right? I'm sure you all heard about it, diversity within academia. Basically, this, not to mention the fact that this whole buzzword is just lip service, but even if it wasn't, disability is never a part of diversity. Diversity is always about race, sometimes it's about gender, but it's never about disability. So the hiring and retention of faculty with disabilities is not even calculated. So when we try to get figures, there aren't any figures because nobody takes it up as a category. It's not enough of a category to even, you know, start counting how many there are. So, you know, those are some of the issues that we talked about within the chapters, and, you know, later on, if people want to kind of, you know, discuss these issues in a more informal way, I would be very happy to do so. One of the, you know, issues that we talked about within the legality is the issue of really discrimination that's not seen as discrimination. So, for instance, I don't know if you all know the Americans with Disabilities Act, but it says, you know, obviously you're not supposed to discriminate people based on their disability unless it causes undue hardship. And of course everybody uses that as, oh, it's too much of a hardship, so we can't do it. And what happens within academia is that when there's kind of smaller departments or institutes that don't have as much budget, if you think that they're the ones who are supposed to provide people with, you know, ramps, sign language interpreters, or any kinds of accommodations, they're going to say, we can't hire this person because we just don't have the money. We're not discriminating, but we just don't have that money. Well, that is discriminating. But of course, legally they can do that because it's legal to do that. So, you know, we talk about issues of that sort, and we share a little bit of statistics and so forth. But again, I mean, really the point that I want to stress to you is that this kind of regime of normalcy in the academy, especially when it gets corporatized, really affects all of us. I mean, it affects us as faculty, able-bodied and not able-bodied, because the whole notion of this publish or perish thing, like that you have to write until you die, literally, and you can't take any breaks, not for kids, and not for your life, and not for eating well, not for sleeping, and not for being healthy, then I think that that regime is something we need to fight for. And of course, it hurts more people with disabilities in a lot of ways that are already need to kind of negotiate workloads from the get-go. But I think it really affects all of us. And if we want to kind of end it, then we need to create coalitions and end it together. So that was my contribution to the book, and I'm really glad to it.